This is a nostalgic review of the AMD Fury X, the first AMD GPU to feature the first generation of high bandwidth memory, an innovative idea that ultimately did not find much success in the gaming segment, and in this video you're going to find out why. Welcome to the Live Games channel, and this is another trilogy about GPUs of the past generations, and if you haven't seen the previous videos, be sure to check them out to see how far the GPU generations have improved over time. Today, I have in my hands the Radeon R9 Fury X, the AMD flagship of 2015, a card some have either never heard of or have forgotten about, so it's going to be interesting to see how it holds up in 2024. And if this is your first time here, subscribe and give the video a like to promote it to the top of YouTube. Starting off with its history, let's go back to 2015. This was the year AMD launched their R9 300 series GPUs, and the video card market was being dominated by Nvidia, who had already released some of their GTX 900 series the previous year. This was a time when flagship cards weren't always the first to launch, and AMD was late to join the competitive GPU market party by releasing their R9 300 series in 2015, starting with the R9 370 on May 5 of that year. AMD had taken its 2-year-old R9 200 series and rebranded the same GCN architecture as the new R9 300 series, which meant models such as the R9 390 and the 390X were essentially rebranded versions of the 290 and the 290X, with enhanced clock speeds and increased VRAM in the case of the R9 390X, which got an additional 4GB of VRAM, making it the first AMD consumer flagship to feature 8GB of VRAM out of the box, aside from the Radeon R9 295X2, which cost $1,500. Overall, the R9 300 series served as a refined version of its predecessor, leveraging existing technology while providing improved performance and efficiency. On June 2nd of 2015, Nvidia released their flagship GTX 980 Ti and took the flagship crown. This was obviously a situation that required AMD to answer with a flagship of their own, and so with that, the Radeon R9 Fury X was born to answer the call, and this was launched on 24th of June that same year, followed later by the R9 Fury, a cut down of the Fury X, that launched on July, and on August of that same year, the Radeon R9 Nano was launched, which was basically a small form factor of the flagships. The then new flagship Fury series cards were an entirely new direction for AMD and were considered extremely ambitious at their time of release. Starting with the chip and the new higher bandwidth memory, the new feature chip was built on the updated GCN 3.0 architecture, which was also physically more complex because of the new layout using a new type of memory. It was the largest AMD chip of its time, with a die size of 596mm², which was 36% larger than the previous flagships, the Hawaii 290X, which had a die size of 438mm², and it was almost equal to the area of Nvidia's GM200 chip, which was on the GTX 980 Ti. The theoretical FP32 performance of the Fury X reached 8.6 T-flops, which was higher than the competitor, the GTX 980 Ti, which had 6 T-flops. But as you know, this figure does not always reflect the real computing power. Speaking of memory, the main marketing feature was the new high bandwidth memory developed by AMD and SK Hynix. AMD had paired 4GB HBM memory with the Radeon R9 Fury X, which was connected using a wide 4096-bit memory bus. This was a shocking number compared to Team Green's GTX 980 Ti, which was only on a 384-bit bus. The chip and memory were now located on the same substrate, which reduced the size of the PCB, reducing the power consumption of the memory, and allowed for direct contact between the graphics chip and the memory, due to which a breakthrough in bandwidth was achieved. And HBM was more energy efficient due to the wider bus, allowing for lower memory clocks, which in turn meant reduced power consumption and heating of the chips. In terms of bandwidth, the HBM Fury X had 512GB/s, which was higher than the direct competitor, the GTX 980 Ti, which had a memory bandwidth of 336.6GB/s. All this looked good and promising, however, there was a catch. The Fury flagship series used first generation HBM, which meant that there were technical constraints to deal with. For example, the physical space available on the GPU die limited the integration of the memory, and HBM stacks are larger than traditional GDDR5 memory chips, and in this case, since there could only be 4 blocks each with 1GB of HBM, this limited the Fury X to only have 4GB of VRAM against the 980 Ti, which had 6GB of GDDR5. All this, and the fact that HBM integration wasn't cheap, AMD priced the Fury X at the same price as the 980 Ti, which was crazy even in today's standards, as this was the first and last time Nvidia would have a flagship card with more VRAM priced the same as its AMD equivalent, which had less VRAM. HBM2 with more VRAM did eventually get unveiled in 2016 and was used in the RX Vega lineup of 2017, and the Radeon 8, which was released in 2019, was the last AMD gaming GPU to feature high bandwidth memory, and this was most likely due to its complex and expensive nature and its delicate state that meant if one chip failed, the entire GPU became an expensive paperweight. GDDR memory managed to survive and outlive HBM in the gaming sector and is currently the main type of memory in all gaming cards released from 2020 to date. As for the software features of the Fury X, the card supported DX12 out of the box with support for DX12.0 feature set, while the Maxwell cards from Nvidia supported DX12.1, which meant a slight advantage in eliminating CPU bottlenecks in in-game rendering. Another DirectX 12 feature was the explicit multi-adapter that allowed softwares to use multiple GPUs simultaneously, even if they are from different manufacturers or types, meaning you could have two 2GB cards in the same system, and both would work together to give you 4GB VRAM, but this feature was later abandoned over time due to its complex optimization requirement. The design of the Founders Edition of the Fury X also deserves a mention. AMD equipped the card with a high-end water cooler and used it in their marketing, stating that the card remained cool around 50 degrees and the pump was also claimed to be quiet at only 32 decibels, which was an improvement compared to the 290 and the 390X and the competition. Now, let's move on to the benchmarks, which will be in 1080p. Starting with the superposition synthetic benchmark, the Fury X has a 29% lead over the 290X. Now let's look at how it performed in games compared to the 290X to see how much faster the new generation was compared to the previous gen card. Starting with Crysis 3 on Ultra with 4x MSAA. We get 40 to 60 FPS in one of the most demanding scenes in the game, and there are some small stutters as you can see on the frame time graph, but this happens more on some maps and barely at all on others, meaning it's poorly optimized, and the 5 FPS in-game difference against the 290X doesn't seem so big at first, but that number goes up to a 20 FPS difference in cutscenes. Next is Far Cry 4 on Ultra using SMAA. Throughout the entire benchmark, we hover around 80 FPS, with highs of up to 100 FPS in some scenes, and the game is very playable and runs smooth, as you can see on the frame time graph. And the generational difference against the 290X gets us an extra 30 or so FPS more in some scenes. If you're enjoying the video, leave us a like and a comment sharing your experience with cards you've owned in the past. Moving on, the next game is Battlefield 4 on Ultra with 4x MSAA. Battlefield games have always favored AMD, so we average above 90 FPS with no lag or stutters. Everything runs smooth and is overall a very pleasant experience, and compared to the R9 290X, the generational leap of the Fury X gets us a lead of 20 to 30 FPS. Next is The Witcher 3 on High. Riding roads around Novigrad, we hover around a smooth and playable 70 to 80 FPS, which is more than enough for a single player like this, and the average lead against the 290X is 20 FPS in this one. And check out the links in the description if you're looking to get yourself an upgrade. We are constantly updating the links to get our viewers the best offers available this end of year season, so give it a look. Next is GTA 5 on Ultra with 8x MSAA. The game runs well on the Fury X as you would expect, and even with 8x MSAA, we hover around a playable 50 FPS with a smooth frame time graph, meaning you can easily play above 60 FPS with 4 times MSAA. Next is Quantum Break on Ultra. We once again hover around 60 FPS with some minor drops to 50 to 55 FPS, so it remains a playable experience, with the lead against the R9 290X being only 10 to 12 FPS in this one. Next is Watch Dogs 2 on Very High with SMAA. We get a stable 50 to 55 FPS with no lag or stutters, so safe to call it a playable and enjoyable experience. Next is Battlefield 1 on Ultra using TIA. As expected, the game runs very well on the AMD flagship and we get a stable 100 FPS average. The thing I found interesting was testing DX12 versus DX11 to see if there were any major performance differences, and yes, there was a 10 FPS difference since DX12 had just started to gain popularity, and this was one of its earlier implementations that came with a cost to performance. So most users would opt for DX11 to get the competitive advantage of more FPS. The case was the same when testing Battlefield 5 on Ultra using TIA. In DX11 mode, we get a stable and smooth 70 to 80 FPS, but in DX12 mode, it's a stutterfest in comparison and we lose up to 20 FPS in some scenes, hovering around 60 to 70 FPS, with some users experiencing crashes in DX12 mode, making this one of the most unstable DX12 Battlefield releases to date. Next is Shadow of the Tomb Raider on High. We get to remain above 60 FPS most of the time, and I did test DX11 versus DX12 to see which performed better, and DX12 gets better performance in this game with a 10 FPS lead in some scenes, and what I found interesting are the 1% and the 0.1% lows, which as you can see are extremely better on DX12 mode, meaning DX12 is more stable and is by default the better choice of the two in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Next game is Control on medium settings. In this game, DX11 is the better performer compared to DX12, with the FPS of DX11 hovering around 70 to 75 FPS, while DX12 is 5 FPS less, leaving DX11 to be the better choice in this game for the Fury X. Next is PUBG, also on medium settings. We get a playable 100 plus FPS in this popular Battle Royale game, with DX11 being the superior choice for best performance with the Fury X. Next is Fortnite on medium with GSR anti-aliasing on low. This is another popular Battle Royale game that the Fury X once again runs well with over 100 plus FPS, but it's not all sunshine as there are flickering textures in some scenes. Next is Far Cry 5 on Ultra with TIA. Everything is good, we get a stable 70 to 80 FPS in the in-game benchmark, so regarding the comparison as the 290X successor, it's clear and safe to say that the Fury X significantly outperforms the 2013 flagship. Next is Red Dead Redemption 2 on High and native 1080p. The game runs well enough, and using the in-game benchmark, the Fury X gets a decent 50 FPS average, which is a decent level of performance enough for a game like this. Next is Apex Legends on low. Since this is an esports title, we used competitive settings to best see how well it fares, and the Fury X does not disappoint, with FPS hovering around 120 to 150 FPS. Next is Days Gone on High. The Fury X easily remains above 60 FPS in this game, with averages hovering around 60 to 70 FPS. Minor FPS drops can be expected in scenes with any of the 40 zombie hordes in the game, but it will still remain the faster card compared to the R9 290X by about 15 FPS. Doom Eternal is next, playing on High. Another 60 plus FPS experience with a stable 60 to 70 FPS in what is considered a highly dynamic game, so a decent showing from the Fury X overall. The next game is Cyberpunk 2077 on High with FSR 3 set to quality. Using this version of FSR gives us a decent and visually appealing experience, with FPS hovering around 40 to 45 FPS, with a somewhat smooth frame time graph, and if you turn on frame gen, then you can get up to 70 to 80 FPS. Next is Mafia Remake on high. We remain above 60 FPS in this one, with the averages being just under 70 FPS, smooth and stutter-free gameplay, and in this game the Fury X leads the 290X by around 27% as it should. Next is Dying Light 2 on high with FSR set to ultra quality. We get a decent 55 to 60 FPS without any major drops in performance, enough to have you comfortably having fun hunting the dead in the game. The finals was next with graphics set to low. This is another online multiplayer that the Fury X gets a decent 60 to 75 FPS, which should be enough to be considered playable for most. Next is Hogwarts Legacy on medium with FSR 2 set to quality. The Fury X does really well in this rather demanding title with a playable 60 to 70 FPS even in Hogsmeade, so it is enjoyable with help from FSR. Next is Spider-Man Miles Morales on medium settings with FSR 2 set to quality. The Fury X gets to give us a 60 plus FPS experience with averages of up to 70 plus FPS, and all with a smooth frame time graph, so no jitters or lag. Next is Remnant 2 on low with FSR 3 set to balanced. As we saw in the previous video when testing the R9 290X, it couldn't handle this game even on the community drivers and the lowest settings, but the Fury X does better and gives us a playable 40 FPS. The Last of Us on medium with FSR set to quality is next. Given how demanding the game is known to be, it's no surprise that the Fury X struggles a bit in this one, giving us only 35 to 45 FPS, which is decent enough for a slow-paced survival shooter like this one. NFS Heat is next on medium settings with FSR 2 set to quality. For a racing game, we get a decent and stable 40 plus FPS, which in this case is acceptable and playable, and you can always adjust the settings to get better performance. Uncharted 4 is next, set to high with FSR 2 set to quality. Even with these settings, we are able to get 45 to 60 FPS, depending on the location, but I would recommend using some optimized settings instead so that you can get a better experience with this card. Next is CS2 playing on low with 2x MSAA. The game runs really well with averages hovering around 130 to 180 FPS and sometimes even 200 plus FPS, so safe to say you can play CS2 with the Fury X. Next is Atomic Heart on medium. In this game, we get a decent showing from the Fury X, getting over 60 plus FPS from the start, and averages get as high as 70 plus FPS in some areas, with minor drops in action-packed scenes where the FPS will hover around 50 to 60 FPS, and compared to the R9 290X, which gets 56 FPS on average, the Fury X is superior at 72 FPS on average. Next is Horizon Forbidden West on medium settings with FSR set to quality. The Fury X gets around 35 to 40 FPS, which is decent enough for a single player title like this. Something to note is that some games would either not launch or would crash on the Fury X, while some that would launch were riddled with artifacts. For example, Warhammer 40k produced green squares on the ground, Alan Wake 2 couldn't go past 10 FPS without crashing with an error message, and God of War Ragnarok and Star Wars Jedi Survivor would not launch at all. So, to sum up the results, we have seen there has been a significant difference in performance between DX11 and DX12, with some games favoring one over the other, and taking into account the 1% and 0.1% lows, it's safe to say that some implementations of DX12 over 11 and vice versa was not always the best, with some games faring worse than others, making the early implementations of DX12 arguably useless, since it took a couple of years for games to properly take advantage of DX12 to give it a significant performance leap over DX11. As for the performance of the Fury X as the R9 to 90X successor, there was a generational leap in performance of about 25 to 30%, which was quite decent. But the Fury X came at a higher price at $649 compared to its predecessor, the R9 to 90X and the 390X, which were priced at $549 and $429 respectively, and the only feature it had to show for it was the high bandwidth memory, which one might say was excessive in terms of bandwidth and inadequate in terms of volume compared to the direct competitor, the 980 Ti, which had 6GB of GDDR5. And in the next video featuring the GTX 980 Ti, we will explore how the less VRAM impacted the performance of the Fury X as years went by and games started to require more VRAM than the 4GB high bandwidth memory the Fury X had to offer. The Fury X was an ambitious yet costly stunt from AMD, and we will explore the final conclusions after revisiting the GTX 980 Ti and then comparing both of them to see which team aged better from a modern perspective. So leave a like and subscribe if you're looking forward to seeing the next video. Links to all the modern graphics cards we recommend are in the description, so check them out and see you in the next one.